Hi, so what I want to discuss in this video is the 1995 paper by Bill Arms, Key Concepts in the Architecture of the Digital Library. 1995 was, of course, like 10 million years ago in internet years, but here's the thing, I really like Bill Arms' writing for several reasons, one of which is that I think he has this really amazing ability to very early on see the full range of implications of an issue and then write about it in a way that really kind of shuts the door on the topic. So I think in the more than, 15 years since Bill Arms wrote this paper, no one has really added anything to these general principles. I would say, though, that there have been two important developments in the digital library arena since this paper was written. One is mass digitization, right? Projects like Google Books, if you want to call that a digital library, conversation for another time. The Digital Public Library of America, Europeana, etc. And the second is user-contributed content, what used to be called Web 2.0, sometimes still is, Library 2.0. Things like YouTube, Flickr, other things that are digital library-like, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to call them digital libraries, per se. That said, though, I think Bill Arms' 8 general principles are flexible enough to apply to both of these new developments, mass digitization and user-contributed content. The only significant issue I have with this paper is that Bill Arms frames it as a rational management scheme for digital content based on technical requirements and use cases, with law following from that. You could accuse that approach of being technological determinist. Sadly, digital libraries and the world of digital content generally hasn't really worked out that way. Copyright law has been in the driver's seat as often as the technology, but that's a conversation for another time. So we'll address all of these issues in more detail in future class sessions. In particular, we'll really drill down into copyright and intellectual property and metadata, which really spans almost everything else that we do here, and archiving and preservation. So the first slice through these principles that I want to take is to take numbers 3, 5, and 6, which I think form a related subset. Number 3 is the underlying architecture should be separate from the content stored in the library. 5, digital library objects are more than collections of bits. And 6, the digital library object that is used is different from the stored object. So I want to talk about how these relate to each other. So number 3, there should be a separation between presentation and content. Since Arms wrote this article, that's really become a general principle of web design. And we've seen the rise of markup languages like XML and HTML and even HTML5 because HTML does that separation very poorly. And some of these other markup languages do a much better job of separating presentation and content, but I'm not going to get into those. That's, again, another course. There should be a separation of the digital objects and the information architecture of the site on which they're presented. First of all, because the same objects can be presented on different sites, and they need to be reusable. But more importantly, because the same type of digital object should behave the same way everywhere. For example, text can be edited, images can be viewed, different file types invoke different applications, etc. And that should be true regardless of the site or the design of the site. In programming jargon, that's called modularity. You can have a module of code that handles how, for example, an image is displayed. And you can reuse that module globally, not have to recreate that functionality for every object. On the other hand, Arms writes, quote, characteristics that apply to all types of materials, right? Some characteristics are more or less universal. And this is the premise behind the Dublin core. Everything has a creator, a format, etc. Okay, so principle number 5 says that what you download is a stream of bits, but what you interpret is an intellectual object. And some of that interpretation can be embedded in the structure of the bit stream that's downloaded. That is part of the premise of the semantic web, which is a whole other conversation, the semantic web. The idea that human interpretation of digital objects can be encoded, at least to some degree. But I'm also not going to get into the semantic web. But remember reading from Chapter 1 of Bill Arm's book, Digital Libraries. He quotes, "A stream of data sent to Earth from a satellite is not a library. That same data, when organized systematically, becomes a digital library collection." What metadata do we need with that stream of data to help users interpret it as a coherent collection? That's the question. This gets more complicated when you realize that digital objects may be what are called complex objects or compound objects. Take a YouTube page, for example. What is the object? Is the object just the video? No. It's the collection of objects on the page. It's the video, the metadata about the video created by the user who uploaded it, the metadata about the video created by other users, the comments, the likes, etc., related videos on the sidebar, etc. Which brings me to principle number 6. As Bill Arms says it, what you store is not what you get. This is much more than a statement about how the web works. Every time you visit a web page, you're downloading a copy of the objects on that page. Caching, as it's called, is fundamental to the way the web works. So much so that there have been legal cases around caching and copyright violation. But again, that's a discussion for another time. So Arms writes, quote, "Legal scholars see an interesting parallel between the computer viewpoint of executing a program to supply a digital object to a user and the legal concept of performance. This may prove to be the correct framework for managing rights in a digital library." In a way that's charmingly naive in light of SOPA, the Stop Online Piracy Act, which, to be fair, was thwarted in 2012, but which is part of a much larger ongoing battle around copyright and digital objects. The architecture of a digital library must distinguish between different, what you might call, stages in the life cycle of a digital object. How an object is when it's created, when it's stored in a repository, when it's disseminated. So I take this subset of principles 3, 5, and 6, and I would argue that all of them deal with the way the digital object is managed throughout its life cycle as part of a digital library.